where's it coming from? Alright. So if anyone's on the road, okay, that's where's it coming from? Alright. So if anyone's on the road, okay, that's where's it coming from? Alright, so here's another quick audio test running through the live stream. Can the live stream hear me? All right, this is Dan. Dan Violet Sagmiller. I'm running the SDC. I just wanted to let you know, well, first off, I have an echo going on from my microphone right now. I'll just do that. Okay, so I just want to let you know that we are running this live session now. We're planning on continuing to run live sessions and the in-person sessions. When I said live session, I mean streaming. And every time that we do this, we hope to get better at it. So if you have any ideas or suggestions, by all means, please go ahead and bring them up to us. Let us know at the SDC. Second off, to anyone who's watching, except for myself and Evan Wright, there will be 2 prizes to give away that will be done right at the end of the video for people who have been connected. I will be calling out names of people who have RSVP'd through the SDC website. So if you happen to be connecting to this otherwise, just go ahead and go to the SDC website. It's meetup.com/soft-dev. And go ahead and register. And 2 of the people who are on there will go ahead, 2 of the people who are still on the video at the end will win full development licenses for Unity. Sorry, not for Unity, for GameMaker. And that'll be version 1.0. And since version 2.0 just came out, this will give you a 40% off discount for the version 2 as well. All right. So today we're going to be listening to GameMaker, a topic on GameMaker, so you can get started in it and start developing with it. It's going to be shown by Evan Wright. Evan Wright is a game development instructor at the Technology Center of DuPage. He's also a C# and GameMaker instructor over at the College of DuPage. And he's also big into retro game programming and has a lot of stuff, including, I believe, with the Tandy color computer, if I recall right. But anyway, he's going to be available on the chat, but this is going to be a pre-recorded video that's playing, which I'll be starting in just a moment here. So if you have any questions, go ahead and just ask them through the YouTube live chat, and then we will answer them as we go. All right, so I'm going to make the switch.
And welcome to this tutorial on GameMaker Studio. My name is Evan Wright. I'm a teacher of game programming at the Technology Center of DuPage in Addison, Illinois, where we actually use GameMaker. So I'm going to tell you all about GameMaker and how to use it and walk you through some of the activities that I use to get my students up and running with this tool. So when you open up GameMaker, you are given this interface here, and you will see some of the projects that you've previously done down here. Now, if you're doing GameMaker for the first time, obviously you're not going to see anything, but as you start projects, you're going to see them in here. So it makes it easy to open up projects that you've already created. And you can see here that I'm very heavily into the classic 80s arcade games. GameMaker just excels as a tool for making 2-dimensional games. So I have my students recreate a lot of the classics. So I'm just going to go up here and I'm going to select a new project, and I'm just going to call this, I don't know, SDC demo or something. No, actually, oops, I put it in the wrong place. Sorry. I'm going to put down here in the project name, I'm going to call it SDC demo. There we go. And click create. And GameMaker is going to create a new project for me. There we go. In that directory that I specified. So the interface is fairly straightforward. It's pretty easy to figure out. Now, I should also mention that GameMaker 2 beta has just been released, and the interface looks very different. However, the differences seem to be mostly cosmetic from what I've managed to gather. So anything that I teach you here is going to definitely still be applicable to GameMaker 2. It's just going to look a little different. You know, the interface will look different, but otherwise the functionality and how it all works isn't going to change. So on the left here, you are given the kind of things that you typically work with when you're creating games. So we've got folders for our sprites, right? This is where all our graphics are going to go. GameMaker has an excellent sprite editor. Even if you don't really make 2-dimensional games or use this as your 2-dimensional game engine, the sprite editor in and of itself is a tool worth knowing. I know people that use GameMaker for nothing other than just making sprite sheets. Obviously, we've got our sounds. Backgrounds are it's fairly self-explanatory. That's where we're going to put the backgrounds for our different scenes. Paths are they're not file system paths. Those are paths that objects can follow around the board. And to be honest, like I've never really found a need to use these. Scripts are kind of like your functions. If you're used to working in a high-level language, you can create a new script here, right? And then you can start typing in code. So GameMaker actually has its own programming language called GML, which is short for GameMaker language. However, if you do not code, don't worry, don't freak out, because GameMaker has a very nice drag and drop interface that makes it possible to do to make a lot of games. Now you can't do everything with the drag and drop. If you're doing anything really complicated or substantial, you're going to have to do the coding. You're going to have to get to code, but you can make a lot of stuff just with the drag and drop. Fonts, that's fairly self-explanatory. Timelines are kind of like to-do lists for objects. You can say on the first step of your timeline, do something, and then 10 steps later, do something else, and 20 steps later, do something else. So a timeline is kind of like a to-do list for an object, and these are very useful. I use them a lot. Objects. This is kind of the heart of the game of GameMaker. This is where you're going to have tons of stuff here. Everything that you make in GameMaker that's going to go in one of your projects is going to be an object. An object is like a class in C# or C++ or Java. If you're used to working in a high-level language, generally, you create class files. This is what you do in GameMaker. You create objects, and then you make instances of those objects. So think of, when you see objects here, think of classes. And there is like some object-oriented functionality built into GameMaker, so an object can have a parent. So you can have different, you can have a zombie and a mummy and a wolf man or something, and their parent is all an enemy object. So it is possible to do some object-oriented constructs in GameMaker. And then this is, remember I mentioned the drag and drop interface. GameMaker is very event-driven, so you can say if if one of these events happens, then I want something to happen in response. So I could say, when this object is created, and now I can start dragging in these pieces over here, and there's lots of them, so you can just kind of tab through these and no, it doesn't seem like they are. But then you can start dragging those pieces in here. So let's say like when this object is created, I want to play a sound, right? So then I'd have to go add a sound up here, and I could say whether I want it to loop or not. So again, it's very event driven. There's lots of events here. It's not just these buttons. These buttons all have sub menus. So there's lots of events. When something happens, do these actions over here. Think of these actions as being your event handlers or being your functions in a high-level language, right? So generally, this is these are pretty well thought out. If you look at the graphics, it's not hard to figure out what they do, and you can learn it very quickly. So now I'm going to click OK here, and since I just created an object, this kind of brings us to the naming conventions in GameMaker. When you create an object, let me open this guy up again, you generally give it a name, obj underscore, and then the name of the object, obj object 1. That's a terrible name for an object, but generally you preface your objects with obj underscore, you preface your scripts with scr underscore, you preface your sprites with spr underscore, just so you kind of know what they are when you look at them. So there we go. Rooms. Think of a room as being a screen or a level. Think of it as being a level in your project. Every project has to have at least one room. I'm going to create a room here, and you can see I can go in here and I can set the size of the room. I can set the speed of the room. This is in frames per second, and it defaults to 30. If you wanted to make it 60, you could. 30 seems to be fine. I don't have any problems with stuff looking laggy or choppy. So I generally leave these settings alone. If you are looking at some older GameMaker stuff, they used to default to 640 by 480. So a lot of books in older games, games in older books sort of assume that your room is a different size. So just be aware of that. But now it's 1024 by 768. Other stuff we have in here, remember our backgrounds. Here we can pick the background for our room. We can say whether we want it to tile. Backgrounds can actually have speeds. I'm sorry. Let me go back to that room. What else here? You can use backgrounds to create tile sets. And something you may find very useful is this concept of a view. The view is like the camera that follows the player around. So you can have a room that is much bigger than the actual screen. So like the port on the screen, that's the size of the window on the screen, right? So you can have a room that is in fact much bigger than the port on the screen. So you could actually have, and you could have multiple views. So you could have a left player view, a right player view, and a mini map in the center. You could have 3 different views all being drawn simultaneously. So if you're wondering, how do I get a camera to follow the player around? Well, that's in views. And then I've never really done much with include files or extensions. Macros are just your constants, your pound defines if you're a C or C++ programmer. You can also get to that from up here, resources, define macros, and then this is where you define the numeric constants for your program. So I'm like a number of lives, set it to 3. There we go. And now I can use num lives in my code instead of the number 3. So all these icons up here, they basically just correspond to these things here. Like the Pac-Man is for sprites, that's for sounds. I think is that our timeline right there? Objects, right? So all of these icons here, they just kind of mirror what you see on the left. And then I should also mention, you can select the build target. So one of the nice things about GameMaker is that it can export or it can build projects that will run on multiple platforms. Now, do you get that functionality with the free version? No, you just get Windows. However, if you can buy the add-on package or the export functionality that will allow you to export code to all these different platforms. So if you want to write something for HTML5, you have to buy the add-on that lets you export that. But they got to make money somehow. So there you go. I have not used the exports personally. I have just used Microsoft Windows, although I know someone who's exported for Android, and he said that the functionality worked great, and there's no problems with it whatsoever. It worked very smoothly. So that's that's the interface right there. So these are kind of the things that you're typically going to be working with. Over here, you're going to spend a lot of time in objects and a lot of time in sprites, and that's not so much in the other places. Another thing I should mention is that GameMaker has awesome built-in help. If you go up to the help menu, say open the manual, I mean, there's just tons and tons of stuff. So let's say I wanted to search on sprites or something. There's all this built-in help, right? It's really great. So if you kind of know I need help with something, sprites or distances or creating instances, if you just put in the right search term, you're probably going to get what you're looking for in the list down here. So just and there's also lots of tutorials online too. So but one of the things that GameMaker really has thought out well is the help. So just be aware that it's there, and if you get stuck, obviously use that as a resource. Okay. So just now that I've kind of given you like the 30-second elevator speech about how GameMaker works, let me just make a very simple project here, and I'll just make a traffic light, and you can kind of follow along, off in video land, and get a sense of how a GameMaker project works and how the flow goes. And if you've programmed in any other languages, as I assume most of you you will find this to be fairly straightforward. So the first thing I'm going to need in my project is a room. So I'm just going to use the default room here. I'm going to just, I don't know, maybe this is pretty huge, but so maybe I'll change I'll change it to 640 by 480 so it's not so enormous. And then I'll just click close. One thing I will mention though, let's go back to, sorry, I'm going to open up that room again. If you're putting objects in your room, you're going to want to be on this objects tab here, and there's a lot of kind of help that's sort of listed on this panel, but a lot of times when you open up that panel, it's kind of hiding. So most people don't see that, and then they try to put things on here, and they'll snap to the grid, and they don't want that to happen. So there's all sorts of ways to put down lots of objects, just by dragging the mouse. You can paint objects on your scene. You can delete objects by painting. You can kind of unpaint objects. But just know that these sort of shortcuts are down here. So there's our room, and I'm just going to click close now. And I'm going to just make a simple traffic light here. which means I'm going to need some graphics. So those are going to be sprites. So let me create a new sprite here, and I will call it SPR. I don't know. Let's see here. What do I want to do? I could do this as 3 separate sprites, or I could actually try to make a sprite sheet. So let me try to make a sprite sheet. That'll be kind of fun. So let me I'm going to call this SPR lights. There we go. And I'm going to click Edit Sprite. And let me I'll say Create from File. And I should be able to actually go out here. Game Maker. Oh, what did I call it? Did I call it stoplight or traffic light? Let me go in here. There's our images. Let me grab all of these and click open. So I can select multiple images at a time and click open. And you see now I've got a sprite sheet with, or I have a, don't think of a sprite as just being one frame. A sprite can contain multiple frames, right? So now I have a single sprite with 3 frames. You can also set the center for a sprite. You can scale the sprites. I'm just going to leave it at 0, 0. Doesn't really matter in this particular example. One thing to keep in mind here is this precise collision checking. This is like, let's say, if you check this, then it's going to do pixel perfect collision. If you uncheck that, it's just going to use bounding rectangle collision. So depending on like what your speed requirements are and how accurate you want to get, generally you may check that, but we're not going to do collision checking in this example, so we don't really need to do that. And we can also preview our sprite here with the little arrow, so we can kind of see what it looks like. Okay, so there's our sprite, and now let's create an object, and I'm just going to rename this object here. I'm going to call it obj_light. Click enter. And now let me open up this object, and now let's just start building out our traffic light. So what we're going to want to do is attach a sprite to it. So let's go down here and select sprite, or the sprite for our lights. Do objects have to have sprites? No, they don't. It's a very common design pattern that you have some sort of controller object in a room that's managing your game. That object would not have a sprite. It's just sort of an invisible object that is sitting there. So I can turn objects on and off. Generally, you want your objects to be visible. The depth has to do with the drawing order. So if you want objects to be drawn on top of other objects, you give them a lower depth. Negative numbers are closer to the camera. Bigger numbers are farther away from the camera. So like if you're doing Frogger and you want the frog on a log, you give the log a bigger depth than the frog, right? So the frog would have a lower depth, like -1 or something. It doesn't really matter what the numbers are as long as they make sense relative to each other. So this object is not going to have a parent, although there are lots of times when you want to use parenting structures. Okay, so now that I've got this thing, I should be able to at least put it in the room. So let's go to the room here. I'm going to open up my room, and I'm going to click on the Objects tab. And now I should be able to just click here and put a traffic light in the room, and I can click and drag it around. And notice how it's snapping to the grid. If I hold the Alt key down, I can position it kind of perfectly wherever I want. And there's some neat stuff. I think if I hold Control and Shift down, I can paint objects all over my scene. And I think if nuts. Well, now I don't know how to get rid of them. Excuse me. Let's see. How do I paint and delete here? Delete all. Right mouse button plus Shift. Right mouse button plus Shift. There we go. So now I'm unpainting them. So that's nice if you're trying to put down tiles or something like that. So there is our object in our room. And now if I run this, I'm going to click the button up here for run the game. Game Maker is going to build our project and run it. Now sometimes you'll be trying to do stuff in your Game Maker interface. Okay, so I know why it's doing that. I'll explain that in a second, and then we can go fix that. If for some reason Game Maker seems to be unresponsive, just click the little stop icon right here, and that will stop Game Maker from running. It's kind of like Visual Studio. You can't change the project while you're debugging. So you have to, excuse me, you have to stop the debugger. There you go. So let's go figure out why our stoplight is going ballistic and would create numerous fatalities if we actually had such a traffic light. Let's just sort of think about what's going on here. We have an object with a sprite that has multiple frames. So GameMaker will assume that that is an animation and we want to play that animation. However, we don't. We want to control ourselves when that traffic light goes to the next frame in its animation, and we can do that very easily. So let's put a create event on our traffic light here. So think of the create event as being like a constructor if you're used to a high-level language like Java or C++ or C#. And let's add a variable. Actually, what we want to do, is tell GameMaker, hey, set our animation speed to 0 when this object is created. Now, the way we do that is by, how do we set a variable? Or how do we know what variable to set? Well, GameMaker is kind of, it is sort of an object-oriented framework, and every object that you add to your project has certain properties built into it, like its X coordinate, its Y coordinate, its sprite, its speed, its direction, all of that, where it was on the last frame. Every object in GameMaker has a lot of built-in variables, and the one that controls the speed of the animation is called image_speed. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go over to this panel on the right where the drag and drop stuff is, and I'm going to drag in the piece, the square piece that says var. So this is the set variable piece, and I'm going to set the variable image_speed to 0. And I'm going to click OK. And let's run that and just see that it has worked. There you go. So you can see that we're not animating anymore. So we've set our image speed to 0. Now, how would you know that? I don't know. I mean, you could, what if I search on animation speed or something? I mean, you might be able to, you could Google it, image speed. There we go. Image speed, right, determines the speed in which GameMaker Studio will cycle through the sub-images in the current instance sprite, right? So there you go. There's your documentation for image speed. What if we search on built-in variables? No, it's not going to give us anything for that. All right, well, let's close that and go back to our project. Okay, so let's get back to our traffic light here, and let's just see if we can make it a little more interesting. I'm going to open up the light here, and let's see if we can get this thing so, you know, when the space bar is clicked, it will go to its next frame in its animation. So we can add an event here, an event handler, and we'll say, I don't know, when the space bar is pressed. So now I have now it's going to, this thing is going to listen for space bar events. And let's go through here and find the piece for changing the image that an object is using to draw itself. So the set sprite or change sprite piece. That's the one that looks like Pac-Man here. So change sprite. Excuse me. So let's pick the sprite that we want to use. So we could change to an entirely different sprite if we wanted. We're going to keep our sprite. And remember, we don't want our stuff to animate. So let's set the speed to 0. Now for the sub image, well, what we want to do is go to the next frame, and there's another built-in variable for that called image index. So we could say image index plus plus. So go to the next frame, the next image index. And now you may be thinking, what happens if the image index is bigger or equal to the number of images I actually have? GameMaker is smart, and it will set it back to 0. It will not kind of run past the end of the array of images that it's got. So let's just see if that works. So now when I hit the space bar, okay, so let's see if we can make our traffic light just a little bit more interesting here. All right, so let's see if we can make our traffic light just a little bit more interesting here. Let's get it so when we click on the space bar, the traffic light will go to the next light. So let me open this up, and I'll add a keyboard event to it. I'll say when the space bar is pressed, well, then I want to go to my next frame. Now, there's a bunch of different ways I can do this. I could use the Pac-Man piece here. Let's see, there's the one for the sprite under sprite. There we go. I could say go to another sprite, and I want the speed to be 0 because I don't want to animate. I just want to go to have it pick a new frame and stay there. And for the sub image, I can say plus plus image underscore index. So the image index is the built-in variable for which frame you're currently using to draw yourself. So let me click OK. And now you may be thinking, like, what happens if you go past the end of your array of images? If you have an image index that's bigger than the number of frames, GameMaker is smart and will set it back to 0 for you. So you don't really have to do a safety check on that. So let's run that and see if that if it works. So now this traffic light is listening for spacebar presses, and see when I push the spacebar, now it will go to the next frame of its animation. Now maybe you're a little bit more old school. Maybe you're thinking, like, how could I put a variable in this traffic light to keep track of what state it is? Well, that's where the macros would come in handy. You could go up to resources and define some macros, and you could say, okay, well, I want red to be 0, green to be 1, yellow to be 2, and then in the the traffic light to create event, I could create a variable. So GameMaker is kind of strange in that it lets you add variables to objects on the fly. So in the create event here, I could add a new variable and say color. Let me call it light color. Color might be a built-in variable, I'm not sure. And I could set it to to green or something like that. So by doing that, by setting that variable, if that variable doesn't already exist in the object, GameMaker will then go add it. One of the problems that I see a lot of my students try to test variables before they've added them. So think of your create event as being your constructor. There's variables you're going to need. Make sure that you use the square variable piece, drag them in here, and create all your variables. So let's delete that because we're not going to need it. Okay, so the next thing would be, how would we get this thing to kind of animate on its own? So let's think about how we're going to do that. We could listen for clock ticks. We could track the frames and use a counter and see how many frames had elapsed and use that, convert between frames and frames per second and seconds to figure out how often to change the light. We could do that. And the way we would do that is with the step event. The step event is very important. It's the kind of your update event. It's the event that runs every frame. So if your room speed is 30, you are going to get 30 step events every second. But there's a better way to do it, and that's using an alarm. So one of the things that we find ourselves using over and over again are alarms. So let's go open up our object again here, and under, I guess it must be main 2 here, this piece that looks like a clock, that's the piece for setting alarms. So what you can do is you can drag the alarm piece in there, and that sets the alarm. That like winds up the alarm, and then you can add an event to respond to the alarm. So like in C# you can put a timer on a form, and then you can have an event handler that listens for, or that is notified when that timer fires. You can do the exact same thing here in GameMaker. Let me drag in this clock piece, and I can say how many steps I want to use here. So let me set it to 30 steps because it'll be 1 second. It'll be easy to see that it's working. And notice I have lots and lots of alarms. There's 12 alarms built into every object. Every object basically has an array of 12 alarms built into it. So what's going to happen now is when this object is created, it's going to set its image speed to 0. Then it's going to wind up alarm 0 to go off in 30 steps. And then how do I respond to that alarm? How do I take action when that alarm goes off? Well, there's an event for that. So it's add event, alarm, and then I can specify which alarm I want to listen for. So this is going to be the event that handles alarm 0 going off. So what I can then do is let me copy in my piece here, copy, paste, there you go. And so just be aware that you can copy and paste this drag and drop code, which is pretty nice. So now when alarm 0 goes off, it's going to change the sprite. So let's just run this and see if it works. Now it's going to work almost. Now maybe if you're smart, you've spotted what the mistake is, right? So it changed once, but then it's going to stay there. So why is that? Well, it's because we didn't reset the alarm. Let's go into the light here. When we create this thing, we'll set alarm 0 to go off. When alarm 0 goes off, we will change our sprite, and then let's reset the alarm. So that's going to be our piece that looks like a clock, and let's set that to 30 steps, and alarm 0, and click OK. Actually, before I click OK, I just wanted to mention what this stuff is. Generally, you're going to say applies to self, but you could go tell another object to do something. So we're going to do an example here after this one where we click on a dynamite plunger and we make some dynamite explode. We could say when our alarm goes off, we could tell when the dynamite plunger is clicked, we could set the alarm on another object. So, and this is where this is really how kind of objects communicate with each other. It's using this applies to field up here. GameMaker really doesn't have anything that's analogous to kind of function calls where you have a reference to an object that you go call a function on that object. Usually it's alarm messages or the drag and drop code, and then you just click one of these buttons to make it apply to another piece. So or another object in your game. But generally, like right now, we just want this to apply to us. So we're going to say this action applies to us. But we could have when this alarm goes off, we could tell another object. We can set an alarm on another object. All right. So now if I run this thing, it should work. Right, so now it's just going to sit there and cycle through its frames. Whee! Isn't it nice? Okay. So let's just kind of open up that object and just sort of recap what it does. So we have an object. It has a sprite attached to it. That sprite has 3 frames in it. When this object is created, we set its image speed to 0 to stop it from animating. And we set its alarm. And then when the alarm goes off, we just change its sprite and reset the alarm. Now, if you're really into coding, you may be wondering about, like, okay, this drag and drop stuff, it seems like kind of kid stuff. It seems like Scratch. Like, what if I wanted to do this in code? Yes, you could absolutely do this in code. Everything that you can do in the drag and drop, you can do in code too. So let me just drag in a piece here and show you how this would work. So under the Control tab, there's a drag and drop piece called Code. And I can just drag this in here, and now I can write GML code right in here. So I could say image speed equals 0 and set alarm 0 to 30. So that would be just alarm sub 0 equals 30. Excuse me. And there's another neat little trick in GameMaker. If you put 3 slashes at the top of a kind of code piece like this, this will become kind of the title of the code piece. So I could say create vars set timer. Whoops. And when I close this now and I click the checkbox, you can see that my comment right there, the 3/ comment, is now the title for that piece. So I can look at that piece and kind of know what it does. And that's one of the things, like, with GameMaker, with these drag and drop pieces for code, it's nice to be able to write the code, but then it's like you see this piece, the icon for code, but you don't really know what it does. So that feature right there with the 3 slashes, that's actually pretty nice. And now I can delete the code piece. There we go. So that's how you can integrate the code into GameMaker. There's actually a drag and drop piece for writing code. So now that we've got our stoplight working, let's add some other stuff to our project that's going to show us how to get objects to communicate with each other, and how to make objects of one type turn into objects of another type. We'll just kind of do something that's a little bit similar, but also add a little bit more complexity here. So what I'm going to do is make a project that's got a dynamite plunger in it. I'm going to put some dynamite on the board, and when I click on the plunger, I want the dynamite to explode. So I'm not going to create a whole new project. I can just I can add new objects to this project. Let me just go into my room here and click on the Objects tab, and I should be able to delete that guy out of there now. And now I'm going to make some new objects, which means I'm going to need graphics for them, which means I'm going to need some new sprites. So let me go to, I'm going to go to Create Sprite. I'm going to call this SPR Plunger. And I'm going to click the Load Sprite button, and I'm going to go into the folder that I have for my Dynamite project and grab the frames. I'm going to shift click there to get the plunger up and the plunger down, and click open. There you go. Okay, so actually that seems kind of big. So let me go into the edit sprite thing here, and I'll show you. There's a lot of neat functionality built in here. Let me go to scale, and I'm going to just make this thing a little bit smaller. There you go. And I'm going to say apply to all images in the sprite. So now when I click OK, you can see that I've resized all the frames in that sprite sheet. And then also I want to start with the plunger up. So is it going to let me reorder these frames? No, it'd be really nice if it. Oh, there we go. Okay, so the little left and right buttons. Notice how I just clicked on that image and moved it to the left. So now I've reordered the frames in here. There's just so much neat stuff in here. It can, let's see, the animation. It can reverse your animations. You can slow down or speed up your animations. Let's see, how would you? So now that we've got our traffic light working, let's make a project that's just a little bit more complicated, and it's going to show us how we can get objects to communicate and with each other, and also how to get objects to turn into other types of objects. So now that we've got our stoplight project working, let's try to kind of add a little bit of complexity to this. And I'm going to make a project here where I've got a dynamite plunger, and when I click on it, all the dynamite on the screen is going to explode, right? It's going to turn those objects, those dynamite objects, are going to turn into explosion objects. So in order for that to happen, right, I need to have the plunger communicate with the dynamite. So I'll show you how we can get using GameMaker get objects to communicate with each other. And this is going to take the place of function calls that you're used to in other languages. When I first started GameMaker, I was like, I don't understand like where are the function calls, but GameMaker doesn't really have that. But it turns out like that the framework that it has works, and you don't really miss them. So let me just open up my room here, and I'm going to go into my Objects tab, and I'm going to right-click on that traffic light and delete it. So I don't need a whole new project. I'm just going to reuse this one. So let me create a sprite for my dynamite plunger. There we go, SPR plunger, and I'm going to say load sprite, and I'm going to go. I've gone into the folder here where I have the images for this project, and I'm going to shift click on those two images and click open. And you can see here under number of sub images, now I have a 2-sheet sprite, or a sprite with 2 frames. Now the plunger is a little bit bigger than I would like, and also the frames are in the wrong order. So the first one has the plunger down, and I really want the first one to have the plunger up. So let's go click the edit button here, and then let's just take a quick look at the sprite sheet editor here. So what I can do is, let's say I want to scale all these frames. I can just go up to the transform menu, and I can say scale, and I'll just maybe make the thing half the size. And there's a button here for apply to all frames, so I'm going to leave that checked, and there you go. That looks a lot better. And notice that they're still in the wrong order. I can actually just click on a frame here, and see the little arrow here? I can move that frame to the left. Now let's say I wanted to slow down an animation. What I can do is I can actually go up here and I can say stretch the animation, right? So I can it'll duplicate each frame in the animation to slow it down. You can have it, reverse the animations. There's lots of stuff in here that it can do. It can fade objects out. It can add glowing rings to objects. The sprite editor is actually pretty good. So now let's click OK. and click OK. There we go. So now we have our plunger sprite, and now I'm going to create an object to attach that sprite to. So I'm going to call it obj underscore plunger. Now, if you get sick of typing obj underscore all the time, I've seen a lot of people just do that. They'll do like O plunger or something like that. Just they'll put the letter O on the front to indicate that that's an object. And let's put our plunger sprite on the object. I just clicked on the little drop-down menu and selected the plunger sprite. And now let's add a plunger to the room. So I've opened up the room here, and I'm going to click on Objects, and now I'm going to select down here in the drop-down and see now I have a plunger object that I can select. So let me click on that and add that to the scene. So now I have a plunger in the room, and if I run my project, what is going to happen? You should be able to guess based on what happened with the traffic light. The thing is going to spaz out because it's playing playing each frame in its sprite on every step, right? It's using that sprite sheet as an animation rather than as a series of still frames that we just want to pick and choose from. So I'm going to have to do the same thing here. I'm going to have to open up my plunger object, and I'm going to add a create event, and I'm going to let me do it a different way than I did before. I'm going to go to the control tab here. I'm going to drag in a set variable piece, and I'm going to say set the image speed to 0, right? And notice again I've got this applies to kind of group box up here. I could actually, in the create event for this object, I could actually pop over to another object and set a variable on that, right? So this really does a pretty good job of allowing objects to talk to other objects. But I want it to apply to myself, so I'm going to say when this thing is created, set the image speed variable on this object to 0. And now if I run my project, we should see that that thing is now it's not animating, right? We've told it don't animate. Okay, so what else are we going to need? Let's create our explosion object. So I'm going to create a new sprite called SPR underscore explosion. And I'm going to click the load sprite button, and then I'm going to go out to the images folder here that I've got, and I'm going to grab all the frames of this explosion. I think Control A, there we go. I'm going to grab all those frames. Now you could, if these were all in a sprite sheet, you could grab that too. I mean, game makers can do all of this stuff. All right. Now this is interesting. Notice that the center of the sprite is still set to 0, 0, but the center of the explosion is actually in the middle of the image, right? So what I want to do is really click the center button here, and now you can see that crosshair is on the center of the explosion. So now when I go through my frames here, you can see that the explosion is, well, now it's centered. What would happen is, I see a lot of students do this a lot. They don't center it, and then when it's created, its origin is up here, so the dynamite explodes, but the explosion pops up down below it to the right, right? So the explosion and the dynamite don't appear in the same place, but we want to center this object. There we go. So just click center. Whee! There we go. I'll click OK. And do I have any sounds? Let me see if I can add a sound here. SND boom. Do I actually have a sound? Projects. Oh, I'm in the wrong place. Did I click the right thing? So I basically went to add a new sound, and then I clicked the open sound folder. Okay, so it took me to my Game Maker projects directory. So let me go into, let me see if I can find, let me just see if I can find an explosion sound effect. Teaching, Game Maker, dynamite, sounds. There we go. Here's an explosion. Okay. There we go. Okay. So now I've added a sound resource called boom, and then let me add another sound resource here called SND underscore plunger. And now you can see why you preface these things with, otherwise I'd have two things called plunger. One would be a sound, one would be an object. There we go. Okay. So now I have two sounds. So you can see how easy it is to add sprites and add sounds and then create objects. I mean, once you get playing around with GameMaker, it's really fun. Okay, so now that we have a sprite for our explosion, let's make an object to attach it to. So I'm going to call this object explosion, and I'm going to set its sprite to the sprite explosion. And I think that's all I need to do. I don't need to set its parent or anything like that. Now, watch. This is going to be interesting. Let's go to the room here, and I'm going to put an explosion object in. So here's our explosion. I'm going to put one in the room, and oops, I clicked the debug button instead of the run button by mistake. So it's going to bring up the GameMaker debugger, which isn't necessarily the end of the world. There you go. So notice that that explosion just keeps cycling through its frames. Now it's animating. We want it to animate. That's great. However, it's not going away, right? So that's kind of a problem. So how do we get it to go away when it's done playing its frames? So let's open up our explosion object. What we could do is use an alarm. When this thing is created, we could set an alarm. And then when the alarm goes off, we could destroy the object using the recycle bin. That would require us, we could figure that out by looking at how many frames are in that animation, and then that would tell us how many steps it would take. But there's an easier way. And I'm going to delete this. There's an event under the other button for animation end. So I will say when the animation is over, when we've reached the end of our sprite sheet, destroy me, right? So now I'll click OK. So when this explosion is created, it's going to play its frames. When it's done with its frames, it's going to get an animation end event, and then we're going to destroy it. So now if I run my project, there you go. So now that explosion is gone, right? It played through its frames, and now it's destroyed. Okay, so that's good. You know, maybe we want to have a create event here where we you know, where we play our explosion. That's not going to work really. If we have lots of dynamite on the screen, I mean, we could do it here, but you know, we'll have if we have 50 dynamite objects, we'll be playing the same sound effect 50 times simultaneously. Which, I don't know if we want to do, but just for the sake of illustration, there you go. So I've dragged in the piece for play a sound. So when this explosion is created, it's going to play its sound, and then now let's run it. All right. So now the next thing we want to do is maybe create some dynamite and have the dynamite turn into an explosion. So let's create a sprite for our dynamite. SPR dynamite, load sprite, and I'm going to grab the dynamite sprite right there, and maybe I'll center the sprite so it's kind of, there you go. I'll center the sprite so the origin is in the middle of the actual kind of image, because it's a little bit offset, because the wick is on the left, or the fuse is on the left side. Okay, so let's click OK, and now I'm going to create a dynamite object, obj_dynamite, and interesting. Okay, so how does our dynamite turn into an explosion? How are we going to get our dynamite to go boom? Well, let's add an alarm event to our dynamite. Let's add an alarm 0 event. And we can, in here, let's find the piece for change into another type of object. So let's take it's this one right here. It's right below the light bulb. This is create a new object. This is change into another type of object. So when we get our alarm 0 message, we can change into an explosion. And then what does this thing right here do? The perform events? Well, this is really mislabeled. It should say perform create event, right? It should say run the create event. So what we want to do is run the create event on the thing we're turning into, because that's going to play the sound effect for us and start the animation, right? So Generally, you want this thing set to yes. There are times when you don't, but generally yes. When I turn into the explosion, perform the explosion's create event. Okay, so there we go. When this dynamite gets an alarm 0 event, it's going to turn into an explosion. Now, who's going to send the dynamite an alarm 0 event? Well, the plunger is. Okay, so let's look at the plunger. Let's go into our plunger. And let's add a click event. So we'll say it's going to be a mouse event. Left, let's say left button. So when the mouse is clicked on the dynamite, then let's go to the next frame in our sprite. So that's our Pac-Man piece. It looks like a Pac-Man. Let's go to the, we'll use our plunger sprite. We'll go to subimage 1 and set the speed to 0. So go to the next frame, and then let's add an alarm piece here. So let's go to the tab with main 2, drag over a piece that looks like a clock. And now let's say, let's set the alarm to go off in 30, I don't know. No, 90. Let's make it 90 steps. 3, 2, 1. Okay, so we can count down. Now, so we want the alarm to go off in 90 steps, but we don't want it to go off on us. We want to say, make it go off on, make this event apply to the dynamite. So now when we click on this button, we're going to be setting alarm 0 on the dynamite. And then when that alarm goes off, the dynamite is going to respond to it. So the thing is that so this alarm message is going to set alarm 0 not on the dynamite plunger, but on the dynamite. So this event is applying to a different object, and that's how objects in GameMaker generally communicate with each other, as opposed to using function calls. And then also we want to play our cool dynamite plunger sound. So let's add that and play the plunger sound. So let's just see if it works. I totally goofed up. Okay, so you probably saw that coming, and I didn't. Well, we forgot to put some dynamite in the room. So let's go put some dynamite in the room. Did I not give my dynamite a sprite? If an object doesn't have a sprite, you have that little blue question mark piece. Let's look at the dynamite. Yeah, so I didn't put a sprite on the dynamite. There we go. So now let's go back to the Objects tab, and I'm going to put in a piece of dynamite. So hopefully this will work. So when I click on this, I'm going to go to the next frame, play the plunger sound, and set alarm 0 to go off in 30 steps or 90 steps on this object over here. Alright, neat. So there is how you can get one object to communicate with another object. Now, here's like an interesting little thing to keep in mind. What if there were more than one dynamite object in the scene? So let me go back to my room here, and I'll put some more dynamite in here. Right, they all go off, right? So that is kind of an important thing to keep in mind, that when you tell when you specify that an event applies to something else, let's look at our plunger, the left button, alarm event. So this is going to apply to all the objects of type dynamite, right? So not just one particular object, it's going to apply to all the objects of that type, right? And that's where the parenting really comes in. You could say, like, you know, tell all the enemies to, like, if you're playing in Pac-Man or something, like, tell all the ghosts that they're now in the scared state, or you know, if I hit the power up, tell, you know, all, you know, I get the golden sword or something, tell all the enemies to flee or something like that, right? So this is applying to all of the objects of type dynamite. So just be aware that GameMaker is a little bit vague on, like, is this one object, or is this a specific object, or is this a type of object? So when we use it here, it is treating it as though it is a type of object. All right. So there we are. That's how we can get one object to communicate with another object. So the last thing I'll show you how to do here, I just feel like I have to do this, is just show you how to get something to drive around the screen. One of the first projects you'll try to do is maybe Tron or something like that, or a Frogger, like a Dodgem game. So how do you just get something to, how do you listen for keyboard input and move around the screen? Let's go over that real fast. I'm going to create a sprite right here, and I'm going to call it SPR, or I'm going to call it player or something. And I'm going to click edit sprite, and I'm going to make a new sprite here. I'm going to click on this blank document icon, and I don't know, 32 by 32. That's kind of huge, but whatever, it'll work for here. Now I'm going to double click on it to open it up, and now let me just bucket fill it with a color here. I'll bucket fill it with yellow. So that's going to be my player right there. And let me center that sprite. Okay, and now what I'm going to do is create an object called obj_player and attach that sprite to it. So now I'm going to go here, I'm going to select that sprite, and now how can I make this thing controllable? Well, let's add a create event, which is the light bulb, the little light bulb icon. So when I'm created, let's start moving to the right at a speed of, I don't know, 5 or something like that. Okay, and then let's add events to listen for keyboard input. So let's say now there's two types of keyboard input. Some are like kind of key repeat events, and some are key press events. So a key press event means the key going down, and the keyboard, this event here, just the keyboard event, is a key repeat, right? So I guess I really just need key press on this one. Let me add, let's say when the up key is pressed, then I'll change my direction to up. And I'll keep my speed of 5. There you go. And now I can actually duplicate this event. I can right click on it and say duplicate event, and then it's going to say, well, what's the new type of event you want to listen to? And I can say when it's a key press down, and then I'll go in here and I'll say, okay, I want to move down. Make sure you don't have two arrows clicked at the same time, otherwise GameMaker gets confused. And then let's duplicate that event. And I'll say it's a right key press event. I'll open it up and I'll say start moving to the right. And let's duplicate that and have a left key press event and start moving it to the left. There you go. So let's, do I have the speed set? Yeah, because I copied and pasted the events, so the speed should all be there. Oh, and I forgot to add the player to the room. Oh. Let's go to the room here. I'll select objects and put a player in the room. Right, and now I have a controllable player there that I can drive around the screen. Whee! All right, so one final last thing before I kind of wrap up here. Let's say we want to make a trail as we're going here. I'm going to make a new object, and I'm going to call it object trail, and I'm going to select the same sprite as I did for the player, and I'll say here when the player moves on every step. So every step, create a trail. So I'm going to drag in the light bulb piece, and this creates a new object. It's like it's your new operator in Java or C# or C++. I'm going to say create a new trail at 0, 0 relative to me. The relative means add these two numbers to my current position. So relative to me, 0, 0 away from me, make a new trail. There you go. So now I've kind of got the Tron light cycle thing going. Oh, my battery's low. Well, that's probably a good hint that I should sign off. Hopefully this has been useful. Hopefully this will get you up and running with GameMaker quickly. Thank you for watching. And I'm sure there'll be lots of notes posted online. I will provide all of the I'll provide the materials for all these projects, which I've just shown you, PDFs on how to do them, and I'll provide you with the graphics and sound to do them as well. So I hope you've enjoyed this and found it useful. Thanks for watching.
All right, mic is on. Yeah, so there's like a 30-second lag from when the streaming processes through YouTube, and then YouTube makes it available everywhere. So, well, it does look like it's just John and I. So there's no awards being given away. All right. Well, given that, I'm going to end the stream. All right, closings. Okay, so any suggestions people have for how to improve this in the future? Obviously, we have a few things that I'm going to try improving. Just timing between the sessions, stuff like that, or between one transition to the next, making sure the audio feed is good, and doing what I can to speed up the time for YouTube to go live. I don't think there's much I can do there, but I'll look into it to see if there is. All right, so talk to you later.